I'm doing another bike build. I posted something a week or so ago about it, a frame unboxing. It's a Ritchey steel frame. It's a Swiss Cross, famous bike, iconic bike. It's a cantilever brake, Swiss Cross frame, which I bought for a reason because I was kind of hunting around for a gravel bike. But everything, of course, is disc brakes. I'm just not a disc brake user. So I'd kind of all but given up on gravel bike frame build. And then I was talking to the Ritchey people. They said, well, take a look at the Swiss Cross. I said, well, I looked at that. It's got disc brakes on it. And they said, well, that's the updated version. We've got the original. It's a cantilever brake. I said, wow, okay. So I looked at it and I kind of fell in love with it. Fall in love easily when it comes to bikes. And I don't fall out of love. I'm dedicated to the one I love. Anyhow, it's cool. So that's the upcoming project. I'm going to do that in the next couple weeks. I'm building a gravel bike frame for a friend of mine that's coming down here next week. It is a carbon frame and disc brake thing, but that's what he wanted. So we're going to build that, and I'm going to learn about disc brakes doing that. But I also didn't know much about cantilever brakes. So this is going to be all new for me, and part of researching the equipment I wanted to build this frame with obviously involves researching cantilever brakes, and there's a whole lot to learn about that. Anybody that's into mountain biking probably already knows. Now, I've never done mountain biking. I don't know about it. I've seen videos of people doing it. It looks like all kinds of fun. So those people will already know about canties, but for me it's all new. So as I was looking at my frame, one of the things I'm remarking on in the little unboxing video are the brazed-on cable guides that run down the drive side seat stay. I'm going, these are curious designs, aren't they? I'd never seen that because I've never really done anything with mountain bikes. Well, that's a typical mountain bike braze-on where the entire cable housing runs all the way to the rear derailleur. To me, it was all new. So that's the level of my competence or the level of my understanding. But I'm going to increase that in the next couple of weeks. And I've been doing an awful lot of reading and research. So it led me eventually to understanding the problem with fork judder with cantilever brakes. And it's a common problem and it can be eliminated, but there are certain things that can lead to fork judder, and cantilever brakes frequently exhibit fork judder. When you hit the brakes, the fork back and forth. And it's basically what's happening is the brake pads are breaking away from the rim and grabbing it again repeatedly because you've got your hands on the levers, but they're breaking away from the rim and grabbing again. It ends up doing this. It's kind of crazy. So I didn't want that, obviously. Who wants that? So I'm reading about different ways to deal with it, and one of the things I read about is, well, if you get these new style mini moto brakes that Paul Components makes, you won't have that. I read people writing that. Now, Paul Components makes top-of-the-line stuff, top shelf, extremely well crafted. It's a great company with a great reputation. Paul himself committed to the community that he's involved with up there, Chico, California. So there's no taking away from Paul Components, what they're about, their mission, their quality, everything. So I sent a message off to Paul, and sure enough, I get a message back from Paul. It's a small company. And I said, I'm building a Ritchey Swiss Cross cantilever. And I'm wondering about the mini motos, and he had a one line saying, if you put these on that Swiss Cross, it's going to be great. So I said, okay, well, there's one corroboration from the guy that sells them. So meanwhile, I have kind of budding relationship with Simon Beatson, who is one of the guys with Ritchey. He's in Ritchey, North America. Ritchey's a small company. There's only about 6 guys in Ritchey, North America. There's more in Europe and more in Asia where the production is done, but it's still a small group of people worldwide. Simon is a friend of my friend, Alex, the Challenge Tire owner. They had a working relationship for years, Challenge and Ritchey. So I've kind of gotten to be able to talk with Simon a little bit more than maybe is kind of to be expected with customer service. And I ask him all kinds of questions one after another because I'm teaching myself, and if he's a resource, I'm going to use it until he says enough is enough. And he hasn't said that, bless his heart. Anyway, so I send a message to Simon. I say, Simon, what's the deal with fork judder on the Ritchey bike? He goes, it depends on how you mount it, the model of the brake that you purchase, and the adjustments and the setup, the finesse of the setup. He says, now there's a modern cantilever brake style that mimics the original old style, where the cantilever brakes kind of go out from the frame like this, and there's a straddle cable, and you pull the cable from the middle, and it raises the brake arms, and that activates the brake pads against the rim. He says the old style brakes work just perfectly fine, but they developed a short arm, old style kind of. And he says what that does is it puts a whole lot more force on the brakes, and they tend to produce fork judder. So he advised against that. He says now I asked specifically about the Mini Moto, the Paul, what it's called is a mini V brake. Now Shimano is the designer of the V brake, so-called V brake. And there's a lot of different versions of that. Paul Components makes what they call a mini V, and they call it the Mini Moto. It's an interesting design. I'm going to show it to you here in a second. Simon said, yeah, you put the mini motos on there and it'll be wonderful. So there's an independent voice seconding Paul's own opinion. Now, I had no reason to distrust Paul's opinion. Why would he say something, they're great and they turn out not great? Well, that won't be good. So it wasn't like I was checking up on Paul. I was just talking to Simon, and I asked him the same thing, and I got the same replies basically the same day to the 2 messages sent the day before. So I went ahead and pulled the trigger and bought those Paul Mini Motos. They're expensive. $360, something like that, for 2. Now you buy them individually because people don't always set the same brake up front and rear. Maybe they have a mini V brake in the front and they have a classical style Canti in the back. That's common. But I bought 2 of them. Now, again, I don't know what I'm doing. I just bought it based on those 2 corroborating inputs I received. Now I get them and I'm reading more and more, and then I'm looking at the Swiss Cross frame, and I notice there's no rear brazed on cable stop for the brake housing from the top tube at the seat post to the brake lever itself. And I'm looking at videos and I notice there's a curious little piece of tubing that runs through a braze-on that's actually on the seat post clamp, on the non-drive side of the seat post clamp of that frame. And I noticed in videos I watched on YouTube of the Swiss Cross, there's a little piece of nylon tubing about that long that goes through that little braze-on, and you run the cable all the way from there is a braze-on cable stop at the front end of the top tube, so the brake housing will go there, and then it's exposed cable all the way back along the top of the top tube into that little piece of nylon housing, and then down directly to the cantilever brake. So I'm saying, well, how's that going to work? Because you need brake housing to run into the little L-shaped, what they call a noodle that accepts the cable on the mini moto. So back to Simon, I said, Simon, what about this? I can't make out what that thing is in the braze-on that the cable's running through. He says, that's just a little piece of tubing, you need that. I said, well, isn't this a curious design? And it's typical. But I'd never seen anything like it. Maybe there's stuff like this on mountain bikes. So I said, okay, so what about the brake housing that runs from there? I don't see any brake housing. In fact, it's not a mini moto, it's a traditional style cantilever, so it doesn't need a brake housing. That cable runs right to a little clamp and the straddle cable. He says, well, what you do is you run, if you're going to use the mini motos, you're going to have to run cable housing the whole way down the top tube, and you just lash it to the top tube with a couple zip ties. I'm going, well, that'll certainly work, and that's kind of what we all grew up with back in the day. And when I was on bikes as a youngster, the cables ran across the top tube, and there were 3 metal clamps that hold the cable in place. You never thought about it. Now you do think about it because it's not normal anymore. So I said, well, a zip tie, that'll certainly work, but it sure isn't elegant, is it? So I, back to Simon again, I said, okay, Simon, so what if I just put you can buy an aftermarket cable stop clamp and clamp it onto the back end of the top tube, and then run the exposed cable from the front to the rear clamp that you've added, and then cable housing to the mini moto. He says, well, that will work, but be sure when you mount that cable clamp to mount it back toward the rear of the top tube, near the weld, because that's where the steel is butted, thicker. It says if you clamp it forward, you're clamping it to the steel tubes these days are really thin. They're sculpted. They're really thin and strong. But he says you want to put that clamp, obviously, on the butted part of the tube, which is near the weld at the seat post junction. And it'll work just fine. You can do that. And I thought about it and wrote it back. I said, you know, the more I think about this, I love the idea of the mini motos. It's beautiful design. You know, it's like machinist art, you know, is how I would describe it. I start thinking, I said, man, I bought this iconic frame that Tom Ritchey came up with 20 some years ago, 26 years ago. And he's tweaked that design ever since, but hadn't been a whole lot of changes, but there's been some changes to make it better. But it's a traditional old style cyclocross frame. And I thought, why do I want to fuck that up? Change it. Well, you can, modern components and everything. I said, well, Simon, how about if I just go with the classic traditional style cantilever brakes where the arms go out to the side. They stick out. That's one reason why they've remodeled them to be shorter, is because they do stick out. You can get your leg caught on it or whatever, if you're not careful. What if I just get the classic style, Simon? And I don't know, it just keeps more in the spirit of what Tom Ritchey envisioned. And I want to kind of respect that for whatever reason. I'm an old guy, maybe that's the reason. And he said, well, in that case, yes. Here are 3 traditional cantilever brakes that will work well on that frame. 1, the Paul Components Neo Retro, which is a beautiful design. 2, there's a brake made by Tektro, which is actually, Tektro is made in Taiwan, but it's an American guy that created, Tektro, and now it's in partnership with production in Taiwan. Maybe it's not a legal partnership anymore. I don't know how he's resolved the ownership of that, but it started out with this American guy, and he was the one that came up with Tektro brake design. They make a lot of different brake products. So they make this one, it's called a CR720. And then he mentioned a third one made by Rene Hurst. Now Rene Hurst makes excellent stuff too. And I'd already seen the Rene Hurst brake when I was initially researching, and I'd seen cantilever brakes made by Tektro and others. So I looked them all up again. I said, well, the Neo Retros that Paul makes are great. They're expensive, just like the Mini Moto. Not as expensive as the Mini Moto though, but still expensive, 100 and some bucks for one one brake unit. The Tektro I looked at, and they look good. Okay, it's a different way of making the material. It's forged or stamped. I don't know what they would call it, but it's not CNC like the Paul is. But it looks great. And I read some reviews of it, and everybody said, man, this brake worked great. And you can buy 2 of them for less than the price of one Paul brake, and it works great. So that was a thumbs up for Tektro. Now I looked at the Rene Hurst again, and they have their own design ideas, and it's cool what they do. Those guys are pros. They make neat stuff. But I decided I'm going to buy those Tektros and give them a shot. Meanwhile, I had received the Paul Components Mini Motos. They came packed in these cool little boxes. And there's artwork that goes all over the box on all sides, on the flap edges, on the front edge of the flap and the box. The art is by a fellow named Chris McNally. And it's just groovy stuff. It shows a guy on a mountain bike with a Paul t-shirt or cycling jersey on, and he's chasing somebody else on a mountain bike. It could be a lady, or who knows. There's a guy over here, where is it? On the backside, there's a guy or an ape or something strolling around. It looks like a smoldering volcano. There's a big tree. There's whiskey bottles flying through the air. A couple guys in a dune buggy with bike racks, and somebody doing this out the window. There's a serpent on here looking at stuff. All kinds of flora and fauna. There's lots of things to look at there. It's cool. Anyway, good on you, Paul Components. Paying some guy to make some art for you. And otherwise, it's kind of a generic box. So I think they're probably thinking, maybe ecologically about that. For all I know, it's a recycled material. Chris McNally artwork, Chris McNally. It's cool. And then Paul, Chico, California. Now that's a logo, and they engrave that on their brake parts. So let's see what you get. I'll show close-ups of this, but basically there's three things packed in here. There's a little wax paper bag, and it's got a Paul logo sticker you can put on something. It's got what they call the brake noodle. This is where the brake housing goes in. Cable comes out here. This part hooks into one of the brake arms, and then the cable runs across, clamps to the top of the other brake arm, so when you pull the brake it goes like this. That's called the noodle, and there's a mounting bolt, two of them. You get some brown packing paper with two brake arms and some notes in it. Now this is cantilever brake. Now this is where the noodle goes and attaches in here, that claw. And then the cable runs over and clamps here. When you press it, the arms, okay. Now the thing's mounted on what they call bosses. It's just two stubs built onto the front of the fork and also onto the seat stays. And these things just slip over the boss, and there's a bushing inside here. They designed this kind of cool. It's all well made. It's beautiful stuff. Anyway, that's what you get, but you also get a set of brake pads. And this is leading me up to what I want to talk about with Paul components. Now they love Salmon Cool Stop brake pads. They love Cool Stop. They use Cool Stop brake pads.